I wonder what the Nameless One's doing these days.
Updated my journal, updated my journal, updated my journal, updated my journal.
Like VCMB, Planescape Torment is one of those rare games where its reputation precedes it, decades later, and we still haven't really seen anything else like it. The boundless, weird potential of Sigil and the Lady of Pain, a cultural, political, and religious melting pot of the many planes that touch on aspects of D&D lore that would otherwise be seen as too esoteric or niche for the mass-market coffee shop fantasy of today, and all of this wrapped up in a personal story that seeks to answer one simple question.
What can change the nature of a man?
For all the game gets right, however, there is a lot to Planescape Torment that hasn't so easily stood the test of time. Gameplay is almost an afterthought, adding all new flaws on top of the many quirks of the Infinity Engine. Quests, including the main story, involve moon logic at times, and in many ways, it's a game that has left many people over the years asking whether it'd be better served as a book. I don't agree. I think Planescape Torment shines as its own thing, the emo stepchild of its more popular Baldur's Gate sibling. No one really knows what it's saying half the time, and it's listening to some pretty strange music, but regardless of what you think of it, it's pretty hard to deny Torment as a singular experience that is impossible to replicate. Just to make this clear up front, I won't be talking about Disco Elysium or Tides of Numenera, or however you say it, any of these spiritual successors, because it's not really relevant to the video. Its said imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and whatever came afterwards, there would never be a game like Planescape Torment again. For what man can die a million deaths to see fate slip so easily through his fingers? Planescape Torment is a meditation on names, relationships of love and loss, fading memories, and the march of time. Anything and everything at once, and while I don't think it's as legendary as others have made it out to be, I'll be damned if this game isn't special. I'm going to keep this section fairly brief, at least that's the plan, because there isn't much to the gameplay in Torment. If you've ever played Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale or any of the other Infinity Engine games, you'll feel right at home here. Stats are from the ye olde edition of D&D called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or AD&D for short, so get ready for our old friend Thaco to show up again. For this playthrough, I focus mostly on the social stats, starting with 18 Wisdom, 16 int, and then summon to Charisma before bumping up the rest. If you want to unlock all the extra dialogue and pass skill checks, most people recommend doing the same. Obviously it's useful for mages too if you go that path. When I said combat was an afterthought, I meant it, because while there is a class system of sorts built into the game, the Nameless One can respec and change back between fighter, thief, and mage later on in the game. Planescape Torment is probably the most blatant example of combat being there out of little more than player expectation, a way to break things up as you move from one story moment or a dialogue sequence to the next. I wouldn't go so far as to call it bad per se, but let's be real, no one really plays this game for the amazing encounter design or limitless build variety. This is a narrative heavy game through and through, while not on the same level as a walking sim or the kind of cinematic slop that has games media falling over themselves to praise. You should be aware of what you're getting into here, even if it's not as intense or long as its contemporaries like Baldur's Gate. Speaking of which, I can't talk about the gameplay of Torment without bringing up the many, shall we say, quirks of the engine, because it's one-to-one here too. I never played the original version, only the enhanced edition that Beamdog released in early 2017, but pathfinding is a major problem in these games. Different formations can help to mitigate this problem a bit, but since most players will be moving with the whole party selected at all times, you'll constantly be running into issues where the Nameless One is blocked from searching a chest, or everyone's crowded around a doorway, an easy cheese strategy because of how enemies behave. To be clear, this isn't a problem unique to Planescape. All Infinity Engine titles suffer from similar issues. Baldur's Gate 2 had some notoriously cramped dungeons, like the one with Furkrag, but it's going to be happening enough that it'll get on your nerves. Really, the biggest problem with the gameplay in Planescape Torment is the AI, which is, frankly, terrible. I have no idea what Black Isle, or potentially Beamdog, were thinking when they changed the scripts from how characters behaved in Baldur's Gate, but let me show you some examples of what I'm talking about. You can see AI is turned on in the bottom corner of the screen, indicated by that little green glow. I've selected the nameless one to move over to some enemies to attack, and the rest of the party are doing absolutely nothing. They're not attacking, they're not moving, it's like they can barely see in front of their face. Contrast this with Baldur's Gate. Your companions were right there with you and would throw themselves at anything as soon as it came on screen, while in Planescape, there's apparently no aggro. Just look at this. Fighting while surrounded by enemies, and the rest of the party will only do what it does the rest of the time. They will only attack if they're hit. If it still hasn't sunk in yet just how bad this feels to play, what you're going to be doing for most of the game is micromanaging the party constantly, because the AI is too stupid to do anything for itself. The isometric camera angle makes this worse when it comes to mobs, because you're going to have a hard time seeing who's who, let alone targeting a specific enemy in a mob of overlapping sprites. For a relatively quick turnaround time, I can't for the life of me understand what Black Isle was thinking when the AI already in Icewind Dale or Baldur's Gate worked perfectly fine. It turns real-time with pause into a chore, which means you'll be cheesing encounters where possible with the most overpowered ability of all, a doorway to funnel enemies through. If by chance anyone who played the original release is watching this, let me know if this was different compared to the enhanced edition, because it's a huge problem. Outside of combat, you have the same staples as the other games like spell slots and thief abilities, even though most playthroughs will go up to around level 12 or so you're not going to be getting access to the best that AD&D has to offer. Gameplay in Planescape Torment is serviceable at best. I can push through it much more than, say, the slog in the second half of Bloodlines, but it's not what people are here for anyway. Balancing is pretty whack. I played on difficulty 3, which I'm assuming is core rules from the other games, and it was pretty easy up until the prison section under Cursed. I spent a good hour or so throwing the nameless one at the swarm of guards down here over and over and over again until I eventually got through it. So make sure you stock up on a hell of a lot more health potions than what I brought with me. But that's enough about gameplay. I said it was going to be brief, and we have a lot more to talk about, because Sigil beckons. I don't think it'd be that controversial to say that Sigil is one of the most iconic locations in gaming, even more so for its time. Remember that, aside from Fallout only a few years before, fantasy RPGs had been dominating the market for ages. Ultima's quintessential European countryside, wizardry's dastardly dungeon crawling with goblins and other stereotypical creatures, and, of course, Baldur's Gate 1 with long stretches of wilderness and the occasional cave or mine. But then we come to Sigil, ruled over by the ever-mysterious Lady of Pain. I've gone into detail before about how I love games that experiment with the form, try to do weird and creative things with the setting, like the mushrooms or ashlands of Morrowind, or the faded glory of multiple eras built upon the old, like Revachol and Disco Elysium, but Sigil would have them all beat. Granted, this is coming from the lore and D&D itself, more than an original creation of Chris Avallone and the rest of the team at Black Isle, but instead of shying away from the esoteric, disorienting nature of Sigil, the team embraced it fully, and what a city we got. One moment, you could be indulging in conversation and debate at the brothel for slaking intellectual lusts, then falling into a maze that is about to give birth to a new section of the city. In a tavern, there is a man that will seemingly burn until the end of time, while the dusty plains of Cursed will rope you into political machinations. This is the kind of thing that D&D needs more of, only for Planescape to meet its untimely end as the Forgotten Realms, as much as I love it, and safer, more familiar fantasy conventions took over. Of course, what would the city be without its people? From humans milling about, beggars desperate for a bit of coin, to fiends, succubi, Dabus, and all manner of strange and wonderful creatures. Sigil is bursting with just as much personality in its citizens as it does its very foundations. If you've heard anything about this game before, it's that most people cite it as the best game they've ever read, and that reputation is for good reason. Basically, everyone you meet, named or not, has some kind of story to share. Not all will offer quests, not all will be so friendly to the Nameless One, but each feel believable in a way that few games can compare to. They're not waiting around for the Nameless One to waltz on through. You are a tiny speck in one city on one plane, not even an iota when compared to all the lives and worlds in existence. This decoupling of the world from the player is something we rarely see in games anymore, RPGs or otherwise, because developers have to make you the center of attention, the only thing that's important. But you're not important. You die and die again, and Sigil and the rest of the planes just keeps on turning. I'll try and keep the companion section relatively brief, because if you've seen that RPG ranking video I did back in 2023, my thoughts haven't really changed much since then. What I will say though, is that I think what I said at the time about Ignis and Valor is that I thought I might have recruited them, I just couldn't remember. Turns out I was wrong. That's what an 8-year gap does to you, I suppose, because I must have missed them in that playthrough at the time. Valor especially is awkwardly placed and easy to miss after a painstaking trek through a dungeon, but as usual, let's go through in the order they're recruited. One last thing, I don't have much to say in terms of utility because companions were little more than an extra blade in combat. Besides Anna, or if the Nameless One ends up being a thief, you'll play most of them the exact same way, melee in most fights with the occasional spell or buff if needed. Anyway, let's start with our trusty Skull. Mort is your tried and trusted sidekick, quite literally so, as he's the only one that has stuck around through the many incarnations that the Nameless One has gone through. It's hard not to love the little guy. He's the first one there and a mainstay throughout the story, only briefly taken away when we enter the lower ward for the first time, but Mort is able to play a key role in two different ways. First, he's the smartass, crude and constantly cracking jokes as a foil to the player, but also never tips over into that obnoxious self-insert quirky that has become so tired and overdone in media today. Secondly though, he's there as a lingering reminder of your past, and a neat, diegetic way to gently push the player forward through the story, offer context where needed, and shares your mutual interest in finding answers without ever feeling like he's been shoehorned into the plot for the sake of it. Along with the fact he's very useful in combat, there's no reason not to have the little guy stick around. Next up, we have Anna, and this is the first part of the Jennifer Hale show. For real, she voices like half of the major characters in the game, in this case with a Scottish accent. The tiefling is useful for her thief skills, pickpocketing is very handy when it comes to getting quest items, but other than that, I don't really have much to say about her either way. She's a tiefling, if you didn't already know, long before tieflings became the big cultural obsession we know them as today, but beyond her relationship to Farod, which is quickly dropped and forgotten about, there isn't much else to her. She's fine. This playthrough, she kept dying, so I eventually swapped her out for Valor. Whoops. Next up, we had the Githzerai, Dakon. I'm just going off this by ear, but I'm pretty sure he's voiced by the same guy who did the druid Sand or Cand from Baldur's Gate 2. Anyway, it's an important distinction to make here between Githzerai and Githyanki for all the Baldur's Gate 3 tourists who might be watching, because the Githzerai are more like monks seeking enlightenment than bloodthirsty warriors. Dakon does a great job of conveying this, and his blade certainly comes in handy in combat too. The little circle thing he uses as a spellcasting tool has some useful spells, like the magic missile equivalent, but he shines as probably the best melee character of the party. Think of him as kind of a samurai equivalent for Gith. Like Mort, he also has some secrets to tell in terms of how he's connected to your past selves, but beyond that, he only offers the occasional comment. He's a strong character in terms of theme and combat, and more of a background presence when it comes to quests. quests. Now to Falls from Grace, once again voiced by Jennifer Hale. If you've seen my video on Wrath of the Righteous, you know how I feel about Best Girl Arushale, but more than 20 years before, Black Isle did a similar thing first with Falls from Grace, a social butterfly that broke the mold of her kin and founded a brothel about intellectual pursuits rather than the carnal. She frequently interjects throughout the story, and major characters will react to her presence, both because of her appearance and her esteemed reputation, but she is also the closest thing to a mage, other than the Nameless One if the player chooses to go down that route. I love Falls from Grace for much the same reason I love Arushale, a character that is a lot more than she first appears. Sure, all the companions in Torment are fairly limited. This is still a world away from the likes of Iconia or Morrigan that would come later, but she's a fish out of water that doesn't despair. Instead, she tries to better herself, and that deserves respect. I've never done this, but the game seems to hint at some kind of romance given the rivalry that forms between Anna and Falls from Grace, but I don't know if this actually results in anything. Overall, probably the best companion in the game alongside Mort, and there's no reason not to pick her up. Like I mentioned, this is the first time I've played with Ignis, and he's okay. Again, companions in RPGs really weren't there yet. This is still only 2 or so years after Fallout with what was little more than a faceless mercenary for hire, besides Best Boy Dogmeat, of course, so it's unfair to compare these characters to the hundreds, even thousands of lines in games that came much later. Still, there isn't much more to him than his initial premise of, hey, a guy who's constantly on fire. This means good damage in combat as a kind of ranged mage, and before you say anything, I know about his links to the Nameless One, but nevertheless, all he really talks about is fire and burning and... yeah, he's fine. I've never recruited Nordum. I guess I missed him last time as well, but to be honest, I don't feel like I've missed out on anything. I think these guys look really goofy in design. Like he's going to start singing a musical number as if this is an episode of Blue's Clues or whatever. Let me know if you love or hate him, but yeah, that's all I have to say. Moving on, the other and final companion for this playthrough is Valor, a kind of Death Knight obsessed with justice. Even though he has like 10 voice lines in the whole game, Black Isle still got Keith David to voice him. Because he comes so late in the game, he's difficult to judge in either respect. His slavish commitment to justice and the rigid nature of alignment leads to a potential scene with the Pillar of Skulls where he'll kill you on learning some information, but I reloaded because I didn't want to miss out on a party member so close to the end. He's pretty strong and worth recruiting for the fight ahead, but beyond that, not much else. Overall, companions in Planescape Torment were a notable step up from the games before it, but if you're coming into this expecting super in-depth romances or personal questlines or any of that stuff you're used to today, that's not the kind of game this is. Bonded together through a shared pain and inextricably linked to the Nameless One's fate, they're in it until the end. Now, at long last, let's talk about the story. If there's a thematic through line in Chris Abelone's work, it's fatalism, understanding the self, and the long shadow of our past. Fitting, then, that our protagonist is the Nameless One, a man who has lived and died so many times, over and over again for gods know how long, that he is simultaneously a clean slate and bound by his past selves. I have a confession to make. Because it's been the better part of a decade, over the years, my idea of Planescape Torment shifted as I ruminated on it. I thought the game was underwhelming from a role-playing perspective, because your past is almost entirely fixed. You have done everything and nothing. The game wanted to have its cake and eat it too, a set protagonist with a predefined backstory, but it's one that you unravel in a way that feels organic, but still ultimately exposition dressed up with flavor. For the record, I was wrong. While I still don't think the Nameless One enjoys quite as much narrative agency as some others of the RPG greats, and particularly the second half of the game is something I'll get into more in a bit, this This story works because the player is positioned as the wild card. Sure, the amnesia trope is overdone, even for its time, but this is a great way to recontextualize the player and the character's role into exploring and learning more about the world. For a character that gets very little screen time, Dayanara casts a long shadow over the entire game. I made the vow at the beginning of the game to free her, because much like how I play Harry Dubois, I personally find it more satisfying for the Nameless One to own up to his past and try to make amends for his mistakes. Regret is a theme that Planescape keeps coming back to over and over again. Regret that things could have gone differently, that your past self was so blind and couldn't see the suffering and loss only a short distance ahead of them. Regret that so many had to suffer and die at your behest, and regret that it took this long to truly reconcile with the shadows of your past. What does it mean to die? To willingly embrace death like an old friend. Torment concludes that trying to outrun death, outrun fate, only causes more suffering in turn. You can buy time, you can even buy life, but it is a hollow thing, and it always comes with a cost. Pretentious analysis aside, I do think there's a lot to read into in the main story of Torment. The shadows that are constantly hounding the Nameless One work in both a literal and metaphorical sense, and the setting itself could be a little more than a stage for the dying thoughts of a man looking back on his life and past regrets, a process of acceptance perhaps. Coming back to the story itself though, the first half of the game is the strongest. I already spoke about how much of a character the city of Sigil is in itself, and the slow burn of your past feels appropriately paced. Touching on quest design quickly, Torment does suffer from moon logic at times, and I was forced to look up a guide about how to progress. I'm all for leaving players to figure things out on their own and gently pushing them along, as opposed to some big dumb marker on screen, but to give you an example, there's a point where you need to get a bloody handkerchief that'll open up a portal. I know, just go with it. Sigil doesn't exactly care about natural law. This involves first doing quests for unrelated NPCs, and then unlocking specific dialogue, which you can only do so after talking to a crystal and a guy in a completely different area, and I'm sure you're starting to get the picture that this gets very hard to follow. In fairness, this is probably the most extreme example in the game. The rest you can pretty reasonably put 2 and 2 together, but especially for newcomers, there are going to be times where you feel like you've been soft-locked, and our trusty journal isn't offering much help. As mentioned earlier, the mostly fixed past of the Nameless One won't be for everyone. People mean it when this game is often called the best game they've ever read, but there is still a lot of depth and intrigue and agency within that story that it's a RPG worthy of the name. The problem that I have, aside from the gameplay I mentioned earlier, with Planescape Torment is that it feels rushed. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the second half of the game. Sigil is the best part of Torment, but suddenly you're thrust from one location to the next, and it feels like you're on a roller coaster, or going through a best of collection for everything Black Isle wanted to cover but maybe ran out of money. Cursed is fine enough, I suppose, but once you met Ravel and get thrown out of Sigil, the story has very little time to breathe and ultimately suffers for it. Now, I wouldn't call it bad. If you've played any of the classic RPGs, most of them tend to suffer in the latter half because of budget reasons, but Torment seems in a sudden rush to answer everything when you've spent the initial part of the game gradually learning the questions. The standout of this section, however, is the return to Cursed, and helping others with good acts to quite literally force it back in alignment to weaken Trius. This is the kind of thing that's only possible in a game like Planescape, and leans fully into the kind of moral metaphysics of the setting, and a fantastic moment for role-playing. Despite the shaky pacing of the second half, it's upon the final push into the Fortress of Regrets where Planescape Torment saves the best for last. Your companions have already walked this road, they knew what they were up against all this time, and yet they walk it anyway. things have come full circle, and it's time to walk into the arms of death gladly. Dakon and Fulsome Grace aren't phased at all and give as good as they get. Despite the limitations of companions, it's moments like these that solidify these characters as some of the greats. However well prepared you are, there's no point in trying to fight the shadows in this section, so just run past them. Dayanara reveals that your immortality has merely been in exchange, one life taken in place of another, so any deaths here will kill off a companion that came with you. I died once during this part, which killed Ignis, but it seems like a fitting end for his character, to finally get some closure at the hands of the man who created him. The final confrontation with the Ascendant One, the living embodiment of your mortality, is where the fantastic writing saves the very best for last. After talking down iterations of yourself that all tried and failed to walk the path you have before, the Nameless One finally understands it's time to close out the circle. Buying some time to return your companions to life, the final fight is actually pretty quick, even for a character as fairly weak as my playthrough. At long last, Dayanara's vigil is ended, and she can finally rest. Mort, Dakon, Ignis, Ravel, Trius, so many lives that have been touched and forever changed by your journey. It is not such a terrible thing to die, and the Nameless One finally accepts his fate like an old friend.
I forgive what you have done. I shall wait for you in death's halls, my love.
It's too bad she won't live, but then again, who does? Planescape Torment is a singular moment in the history of RPGs. Perhaps it's for the best that it cannot be replicated. Like many of the greats, it was a product of a very specific time and place, a wildly creative team of people, and the technology that made it possible to tell in a way that's lasted decades. Despite its lackluster gameplay, occasional bumps in writing quality, and the kind of logic to progress quests that puts Silent Hill puzzles to shame, I have a lot of respect for it. There are simply very few other games that have so deftly tackled its thematic depth and range so well. If you're the kind of person that doesn't like a lot of reading in RPGs, or struggles with some of the more archaic rules of older D&D, it's okay if this game isn't your thing. No one should feel obligated to play something simply because it's popular. Planescape certainly has its problems, but it has nevertheless managed to stand the test of time. Studios come and go, genres shift and design conventions change, and yet Torment feels as relevant and poignant as ever. It's a great story wrapped up in a fairly average game to play, and if Planescape as a setting was to truly die, we couldn't have asked for a better final note to go out on.